It's Wednesday, September 11, and this is the ECMA TC39-TG3 meeting.
All right. Agenda. Yes, please add anything to the agenda that's not already on there that you want to talk about today. I have a quick item at the top, which is looking for thoughts and feedback on the proposal to, well, let me give some background. The OpenJS Foundation, whose projects include such favorites as Node and NVM and Express and assorted other fun
jQuery
projects, and jQuery. Yes, of course. How can I forget jQuery? I don't have the list in front of me. Sorry. QUnit, or QUnit, as some folks say. Yes, there are, and lots of other things. Webpack, right? What else is in there? ESLint, maybe? I don't know. All right.
Yeah, this is like a bingo game.
So there is, yeah, there is, yeah, get out your cards. There is, among, other than being the sort of the host of those projects and supporter of those projects, etc., there are groups within it. They're called collaboration spaces that do different things. So, for example, there's the standards collaboration space where we do standards things. And there's the security collaboration space where we do security things. So one of the things that the security group is doing is beginning the process to form a CNA for the OpenJS Foundation. A CNA is the CVE numbering authority. So anytime there is a CVE for a vulnerability in a project, somebody has to issue that CVE, and the bodies that issue those are called CVE numbering authorities. So MITRE is kind of the big root one, but then there's also Red Hat is a CNA, IBM is a CNA, Mozilla is a CNA for their products, and then of course GitHub is a CNA. And so anytime you want to create a CVE, you have to go to one of these people and say, can we please have a CVE? So the OpenJS Foundation is trying to form one of these primarily for its projects. I would like to propose that the scope of the OpenJS Foundation CNA also includes the JavaScript and specification and related specifications. So Intel source maps, anything within that realm. This is ultimately something that needs to go to committee, but it only makes sense to bring it to this group first to get feedback. I see Nicola's hand up, but just to give a little bit of more of information of what the impact of this is. It doesn't really mean we necessarily do anything differently than we're doing today. Right now, historically, when we've had the one issue that has come up, right, for the spec so far, since we've adopted our disclosure policy or security policy, has been we requested the CVE through GitHub. GitHub scope includes basically anything that's hosted at GitHub, and that's why the spec was in GitHub scope to be able to issue us a CVE. That would not change. We could still continue to request CVEs through GitHub, even if the OpenJS Foundation scope included the specifications. It's not exclusive. The scopes can overlap. So the main thing that this would do is prevent folks externally, right, outside of committee, outside of TG3, outside of the editors, etc. It would prevent them from going directly to a root CNA like MITRE and getting a CVE for a vulnerability in the spec without coming to us first. So with that being said,
I did not understand that.
So the main effect that this would have if we did this would be that if an external party wanted to file a CVE for the JavaScript specification or related specifications, if they tried to go to a root CNA like MITRE to get a CVE assigned, MITRE would basically refuse that and say you have to come to the OpenJS Foundation CNA or talk to the TC39 folks, and they would not issue the CVE there. That has a benefit because if that happens, and once somebody does that and there's a CVE issued, because MITRE doesn't really, let's say, do as much fact checking as we might like them to. And so it can be relatively easy to get that CVE assigned. Once that happens, it is very, very difficult to dispute and get it changed if there's something wrong with it or something that we don't agree with. So that would give protection there. So I will stop there and go to the queue. So Nicolo?
Yeah, well, I actually partially answered this already. I was gonna ask whether this is just a convention that, like, by convention we publish our CVs there, or if there is like if it is enforced. But I guess you already answered this. Like, I assume there is some global database mapping project to the relevant CNAs.
Yeah,
Do we have to go somewhere and write for ECMA 262, this is the relevant CNA?
sorry, I didn't understand the last part of your question.
Like the question is how, so this is just me like not knowing how these things work.
Yeah.
Like how does, in this case, one of the root authorities that you mentioned know that for our projects, people have to go to OpenJS?
Oh, they know that because it would be in our scope. So basically and you can look this up, you can look at go to this CNA Partners website. And so if you look up IBM, it'll say the scope is IBM products and services. If you go to GitHub, it says something to the effect of projects hosted on GitHub.
That aren't covered by any other CNA.
There can be overlap.
Okay, because I think GitHub's one specifically says they won't do it if they think that.
Yeah, you can write your scope to abdicate the overlap, but the overlap can't exist, and that's okay. And then to clarify as well, this is a human manual process. Somebody at MITRE has to basically read all of the scopes, which are all pros, and decide which ones apply. And it is a convention in the sense that they don't have the manpower, I guess, the human power to actually go check with each project before filing a CVE for it. The CNAs are something that they have decided they do have the resources to do. So it's their own convention and that's where we get the ability.
Right. And if they did make a mistake in failing to do the lookup and they end up assigning it anyway, because it would have been limited to our scope, that would be much easier we would basically immediately gain control of that CVE, and that would not be possible if we did not do something like this. So Jordan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so the capability of like if MITRE had sufficient resources, you wouldn't need to be a CNA to get the ability to have like right of first triage, essentially. Because they don't, this is the way to do that, and that's valuable. I think that the likelihood that someone is going to submit a CVE directly to MITRE without checking with us for a spec related vulnerability is low, but it's certainly not zero. I think that if this is a capability we value, then it actually might make sense for us to make our own CNA, because we don't want like necessarily everybody who's triaging things for OpenJS projects necessarily to gain the confidential information from an untriaged report. And I think it would be like an administrative convenience to sort of squeeze our way into theirs, but I think it's probably not the best approach. If we decide this is valuable, like I think, in other words, I think we should probably try and become our own CNA.
As with TC39 or ECMA?
Doesn't matter, either one. It's free, and it's just about somebody has to volunteer people have to volunteer the time to do the bureaucratic stuff and the training to like sign up, and then we have to like triage the reports that whenever they may come in. So because it doesn't cost any money, ECMA could certainly do it for all of ECMA, but it would probably be simpler to just do it for TC39, but I'm not particularly attached.
I have a response to that, but Mark, you have your hand up.
Yes, before I speak, could I ask that the recording be paused?
All right, back from our pause from the recording, the resolution on the previous topic is that we will think about it. And then and now we'll talk a bit about decimal. We have Jesse and Shane here. Where did we leave off?
If I remember correctly, we were talking about some of the issues with the data model for decimal. There were a couple of options up in the air, maybe even more than two. We were talking about different notions of precision of a number, and how the one that's on offer from IEEE 754 may or may not be suitable for some use cases. I believe Mark a couple of weeks ago had done offered some nice reflections about how this is perhaps a bit unsatisfactory, which then opens up the discussion. Well, if that is that really unsatisfactory? Do we really want to keep these trailing zeros? Can we really rely on any consistent notion of precision that's coming from those things? The alternative to all that being abandoning any notion of precision and saying, well, the data model for decimal would be just points on the number line, magnitudes, in other words, with no precision. There are kind of exact representations of points on the number line. And then the question is, what does this impact? Are there any theoretical properties about that currently exist with, say, triple equals and object.is? Are we willing to violate any of those? What about some of the use cases coming from Intel, namely from number format and plural rules? That was the overall salad of topics that we had, if I remember correctly.
Right, and thank you. That reminds me that we were considering making explicit the multidimensionality of decimal objects so that they could continue to carry precision as an n-band secondary dimension for the purposes that Shane was advocating for, having a mechanism in for carrying this precision band of information into internationalization APIs for purposes of rendering varying precision of numbers.
So let me just point out that a decimal object that carries, the precision for that purpose, is fine as an object. It's inconsistent with retroactively rationalizing that object as the object wrapper, as being the object wrapper for a primitive, since the primitive would not have that precision information.
Yeah, so concretely, the idea would be to have to decouple those concerns such that we leave a void in the language for a primitive decimals box prototype object, and then use a different name for carrying precision, or perhaps even generalizing the notion of carrying precision for internationalization APIs. Perhaps there's an Intel object for carrying a number of any type and its corresponding precision information, or specifically decimal. I don't know.
Yeah, with regard to the Intel, the formatting use as it's been explained, I'm also wondering if there's a static versus dynamic confusion here, which is the number, the format at the point of rendering, I would expect is a static property of the program asking for the rendering at that point, not one that sort of depends on propagating static information, and not one that should change depending on the actual numeric data being fed in. I mean, for example, if the call to render is occurring in a loop, I wouldn't expect each iteration of the loop to be to render with a data dependent rendering. I would expect all iterations of the same loop to have the same rendering. I'm not a numerics guy. I'm not an Intel guy, so I might be reading all of this wrong. But so I wanted to raise that as just a question for people to respond to.
Not quite sure I understand what you're referring to, because I mean I guess in the internationalization context, please correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misrepresenting or oversimplifying things. Then we're working often with some kind of locale, which is kind of loaded in the background, and then so in some sense that is dynamic, but in another sense that's static, and I guess that directly influences the rendering. Or maybe I misunderstood your point.
For the purpose of my question, I would consider locale to be static. It's not. It doesn't vary with the individual number. Is really what I'm getting at here. I certainly can imagine that there's such loops that call some rendering thing that might themselves be parameterized with how many digits should be rendered, but in which case I would still consider that for the purpose of this question static. So maybe static's not the right term, but the point is that it's not data dependent in a way that varies dynamically with each individual number. And if that's the case, then try to carry the information with the individual number seems like a category error.
I would love to hear.
I can respond to Mark Miller's comment there. I don't know how many of you have read the rather lengthy post I made on the decimal proposal repository, but in that post, I directly address this point that Mark Miller just raised about the category error. I specifically have just like 2 paragraphs in my response that directly address this exact point. And you can go read that for a more thorough write-up. But basically, the idea that a number carries its precision, and then the formatting the formatting and display of that number, those are 2 separable concerns. The job of an internationalization API is to take a date, is to take a number, is to take a duration, a list, and to apply the locale to that, and apply the symbols. Look up the name of the month in the correct in the calendar system, right? Look up what to use as a decimal separator and the grouping separator, for example. The job of an internationalization API is not necessarily to perform transformations on that input, and whether or not pre-existing, there's examples of of mixing of responsibilities in the past. There are examples of that, but the pure operation of localization is take a value and apply a locale to that, not change the value that you're formatting. And for example, this is why the precision of a decimal is absolutely relevant to is part of the identity of the value being formatted, not part of the format of that value. And I explain why in the post. But I hope that addresses Mark's question that that in terms of the category error, the category is in the value, not in the locale.
Okay, that's directly responding to the question I'm asking. Thank you. I'm surprised, but it's certainly directly responding to the question I asked.
I would elaborate that it's also that while the propagation of specificity or precision or significance is not intrinsic, is not the domain of the internationalization API. It's also not the domain of the number. Or at least it would be tragic to conflate a specific regimen for the propagation of specification over mathematics, especially if that doesn't have any grounding in any, especially given that it is domain specific, and the decimals specified precision propagation is rooted in probably, I'm assuming, archaic propagation rules. That, like, for example, if you were to use modern GAAP accounting practices, there are presumably different rules. Or maybe they're the same. This is not, I am not in that field. But I do know that science uses a variety of different mechanisms for propagating precision. And it would be interesting, I think, to maintain a separation of concern.
So here, what I believe I know about this from years ago when I looked at it was that the IEEE notion of precision and precision propagation does in fact have zero mathematical coherence with regard to any mathematical or scientific notion of precision. But from what I also remember, I would not at all be surprised if it does correspond to modern accounting practice, because what I think I remember is that modern accounting practice simply codified the financial accounting practice that evolved in pencil and paper.
Shane, do you know?
I was raised to respond to what you had said. So let's think about precision in two different ways. So let's first think about a hypothetical floating point number that maybe had encoded in itself, like, this is how many, this is basically my error bars. Let's think about like a floating point number that had error bars encoded into it, right? That would be one way of expressing a number with precision. That formulation of number with precision is very much a computer concept, not a human concept. And therefore, that notion of precision is not directly applicable to what we can do with internationalization. However, a decimal number is rationalized as a string of digits, a string of human readable digits in base 10, right? And this string of human readable digits in base 10 is something that humans interact with. This is how humans interact with numbers and think about numbers. So the style of precision that is used in something like a decimal, that basically says this is how many decimal digits I have in my number. Please consider this as a unit for me. Is relevant to the internationalization use case. The way that those digits are propagated in calculations and things, as I think I said last week, is not necessarily in the domain that's relevant to the internationalization, but the representation of them absolutely is.
So
I'm raising specifically the propagation issue, because in the absence of the propagation issue, the question about whether this is mathematically or scientifically coherent doesn't even arise. It only arises when you look at the propagation.
So concretely, what I am proposing is an attempt to reconcile these two different feelings about the conflation and separation of these concerns. I'm proposing that we leave a space for a single dimensional magnitude only decimal primitive in the future of the language. I'm proposing that we include a decimal that does propagate precision in the way that decimal, as proposed, just by a different name, where those two concerns are conflated, that those introduce a precedent for a protocol for extracting the magnitude and precision of numbers in general that an internationalization API would utilize. With high coherence and low coupling specifically to decimal. Is that interesting, Shane?
The general framing of what you said sounds like it could be something we could look at. I would want to see like concrete, like a concrete proposal for like what the shape is of these things, but like something along those lines, yeah, could be we could discuss.
I see Nicola.
Yeah, I'll raise my hand to suggest something similar to what you suggested, but I disagree with one of your points, Chris. That is, I don't think we've heard an actual use case for propagating precision in some way. So I think we should start with this decimal plus precision wrapper that like does not propagate precision, that does not have mathematical methods, and instead just something that you get when attaching precision to decimal. Because we know that the way that IEEE, whatever number it is, propagates precision in a way that for many cases is not what people need.
So if I can restate your position, it's essentially the same position in the long term. It's a difference of what position we start from. That we would start from the precisionless decimal versus the precision full decimal. Is that right?
No, I think we should start with both. There are clear use cases for decimal, and it should not carry precision when doing operations like decimal.add, because in many cases the way it carries precision is wrong. There is, however, a clear need for having a decimal with precision. So we should in parallel have that. But
Okay.
like that's just a decimal with precision and not something that has operations over the precision.
I see.
I think I'm next. Yeah, so error bars are not just for computers. That's something you talk about in like high school science classes, but that's definitely still a niche use case, right? Like, I'm certainly not arguing that's a thing normal people think about. I don't think that humans think about numbers in terms of precision, keeping decimal places. I think the vast majority of people on the planet think 1.0 and 1 are the same number. I really like the idea of having future primitive decimals that don't keep precision and the object wrapper that wraps a decimal and some number, some precision, which could be like a big int or something. And then that can have what the precision specific things and doesn't need to be a primitive, and it still, it's more convenient and able to be coordinated than just telling people, oh, well, just have two pieces of data you can stick in an object or an array or something and make up your own wrapper. So I'm very on board with that as a plan. It seems like it checks all the boxes. That's all.
Yeah, I'll go and jam on this a little bit. So let's suppose that we had one of this, separate standalone, non-primitive type that, had a number and a precision associated, right? I sort of, so with such a type, let's suppose that you had such a type, and you had two decimal numbers or two numbers stored in that type that were corresponding to decimal that were corresponding to decimal values, right? and let's suppose that you were to, you know, perform an addition operation on those two numbers, right? And then somehow get back this, you know, number with precision type at the end, right? It seems so. One of the issues that we have with float with the float based numbers, right, is that, you know, there's quantities that can't be represented exactly, like 2.3 and whatever the other ones are, right? But if you have this upgraded, there's this upgraded non-primitive type that basically says, well, here's a number and here's the associated precision. The language now gains a way to exactly represent those quantities, right? So introducing this type in some ways, it could be backed by a number and still largely have all the same capabilities and the same motivation of the decimal proposal. Because one of the main motivations of the decimal proposal is to be able to give JavaScript, the language, a way to represent these values. But this new type we're talking about has a way to represent those values. So like, I feel like we're sort of talking about like, you know, in other words, if we talk about adding this new upgraded type, the motivation for also, in addition to that, you know, talking about, well, we can also add decimal doesn't seem to carry as much weight as it used to, which is fine. But I just wanted to raise that.
So the decimal proposal implies a concrete a bit-packed binary representation, does it not?
There's a bit of flexibility there, but there's really, yeah, you have it right. There's just a handful of ways to get that quite right.
Is it a possibility that the language eventually would have a decimal typed array?
Good question. I think there is some obstacles there because there are a couple of distinct representations. Like with 128 bits, I can think of 2 different layouts, and then I guess you can imagine if you want to make things more complicated, switching, say, bit order for high end versus low end. Now we're talking about 4.
I mean, NAN has 65,000 and we're cool with that. So
Yeah, there are. This all rhymes with problems that typed arrays already deal with.
Yeah, this decimal spec defines 2 representations for base 10, and we would have to pick one.
Or both.
Or both.
We did pick little and big endian after all.
Well, at the moment, the spec tries to be neutral about that, but it's, I guess, TBD how long we can maintain that position. It's possible that we could be back into a corner.
Yeah, I mentioned this in terms of like coherence with the language and the limit as it evolves, that I believe Shane is making the case for specifically. So I'm making the case that there be a protocol that communicates between a primitive type or a primitive type or an object type between the internationalization APIs and new numbers with precision. I am not suggesting that an object tuple would replace this decimal representation, because I think that it does imply that the implementation has a compact binary representation behind it. And I am not suggesting that we fully decouple or generalize the notion of precision, just introducing a protocol that would allow for it to be by other types to participate.
I think even if, so okay, first I had my hand raised to answer what Shane said before. I still see value in decimal. You have this number in precision for like 2 reasons. One is that if, as I suggested, we're not gonna make it easy to do operations with a number with precision, as in precision is not automatically carried around with operations, then you still need like decimal when you want to do math, and a float plus precision is not enough. And second is that decimal, like one of the goals here is to be able to receive numbers from other places. And like those numbers, decimal just can contain a larger number of points on the numbers line than floats can.
I'll note procedurally that it is now the hour.
Okay.
This
Oh,
is a
and then
very
I wanted
popular
to
topic.
answer what Chris said, that like even if we have a protocol, I still think there should be one built-in object that implements this protocol.
I have one question also for people here is, I've not finalized my travel to Tokyo, but like if this type of topic if it would be productive for us to have conversations there. I'm raising this because the TC39 Tokyo is coming up relatively soon, and I would probably want to arrange my plans if this type of topic would be something we think would be useful to discuss there.
Yeah, absolutely. I intend to submit an item there, probably just an update, and we can definitely continue the conversation in that setting.
And I know Mark, you will be there. I will not. I would not be there to advocate this particular position, but I also don't feel that I need to. I am content to put a hint out about the possibility of reconciliation and letting it fall where it falls.
I will be in Tokyo.
Yeah, same.
I will not be in Tokyo, but will attend the whole meeting remotely.
All
From
right.
like 3 a.m. to 9 a.m. I have to go now.
Yeah, no, I think most of us have to go. Thank you again for attending the here and hearing our arguments. And of course, this venue is open if we want to continue conversation in the future. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.